The summer of 1945 found the surviving architects of the Third Reich in a state of suspended animation, a purgatory of concrete and barbed wire. They were not in standard prisoner-of-war camps. They were in Allied interrogation centers, the most famous being Ashcan in Luxembourg and Dustbin in Germany. Here, the captured elite of the Nazi war machine, field marshals, generals, admirals, ministers, and industrialists, were held for debriefing. Their war was over, but a new, more subtle conflict had begun, the battle for historical narrative and scientific advantage. It was in these sterile, closely monitored rooms that the first, fragile whispers of a new kind of weapon began to circulate among them. The environment was designed to break down their sense of importance. Stripped of their ornate uniforms and medals, dressed in simple, identical fatigues, they were men divorced from the power they had once wielded. Their world had shrunk from continents to a few square meters. Yet, their minds remained sharp, their egos barely diminished. They discussed strategy, blamed Hitler for his fatal errors, and debated the inevitability of their defeat at the hands of the Soviet steamroller in the East and the overwhelming material advantage of the Western Allies. Their conversations, secretly recorded by their captors, reveal a group still convinced of their intellectual and martial superiority, viewing their capture as a political, not a military, failure. The war in Europe had been decided, but for them, the intellectual war continued. The initial whispers were vague, often dismissed as propaganda or fantasy. Some had heard fractured radio reports before their capture. Others had picked up snippets of conversation from their less senior guards. The word atomic was used, but its full implications were not yet understood. The prevailing belief among many was that the Americans were exaggerating a new, conventional blockbuster bomb of unprecedented size, perhaps a 10-ton or even a 20-ton device. To men who had presided over the bombing of London and the firestorms of Hamburg, the concept of a single bomb destroying an entire city was a tactical abstraction, not a physical reality. Their frame of reference was the tangible: tanks, artillery barges, aircraft sorties. This new idea fell outside their doctrinal understanding. The German High Command's reaction to these early rumors was a mixture of skepticism and intellectual curiosity. They were, after all, products of a culture that revered scientific achievement. Many, like Albert Speer, the armaments minister, and General Heinz Guderian, the master of armored warfare, considered themselves modern, technically minded men. They knew that the laws of physics theoretically allowed for such a release of energy, but the engineering challenge of achieving it within the span of a few years seemed insurmountable. They were aware of the basic principles of nuclear fission. Their own Uranverein, or Uranium Club, had explored the possibility. But the consensus among the detained generals, formed in their hushed courtyard conversations, was that the Americans had simply thrown more resources at a problem that the German scientists had correctly deemed impractical for the short duration of the war they had anticipated. This belief was rooted in a profound and telling miscalculation of their enemy. They had fatally underestimated American industrial capacity and organizational genius at the start of the war, and they were now repeating the error in the scientific realm. They saw the Manhattan Project not as a singular, focused, and brilliantly managed scientific enterprise, but as a typically American exercise in brute force application of money and manpower. In their view, Germany had chosen the path of tactical and technological refinement. The V-2 rocket, the Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter, while the Americans had pursued a clumsy, inefficient, and ultimately less elegant solution. The whispers of the bomb were thus filtered through this lens of technological arrogance. The atmosphere changed palpably on August 6, 1945. The official Allied announcement of the atomic bombing of Hiroshima cut through the speculative chatter in the interrogation centers like a physical shockwave. The whispers from the West were suddenly a deafening roar of confirmed fact. Their British and American interrogators, who had been patiently collecting their insights on Soviet military tactics and the Eastern Front, now had a new topic. The news was delivered with deliberate gravity, its veracity underscored by the sheer weight of the official channels from which it came. The initial, almost smug, skepticism that had characterized their earlier discussions evaporated, replaced by a stunned, and for some, deeply troubled, silence. The first coherent reactions, captured on the hidden microphones, were not of awe at the destructive power, but of immediate and frantic reassessment of their own scientific program. The question was not, how could the Americans have done this, but why did we fail? The conversation instantly turned inward, toward a frantic and self-justifying post-mortem of the German nuclear effort. Figures like Field Marshal Erhard Milch, the Luftwaffe logistics chief, and General Walter Warlimont of the OKW staff could be heard debating the decisions made years earlier. They spoke of the lack of priority given to the project, of the diversion of resources, of the physicists who they believed had misled them about the feasibility. It was a conversation laced with the bitter taste of a missed opportunity, a realization that the ultimate weapon, which could have reversed the fortunes of a war already lost, had been within their theoretical grasp, but had slipped away due to a combination of strategic misjudgment and, as they would later claim, a lack of political will from Hitler himself. The whispers from the West thus marked the end of one psychological state and the beginning of another for Hitler's generals. It shattered the last remnants of their worldview, a worldview built on a hierarchy of martial and scientific prowess with Germany at its apex. The bomb was not just a new weapon. It was an irrefutable demonstration that their enemies had surpassed them in the most fundamental arena of national power, the application of pure science to create overwhelming force. The confident, dismissive whispers were replaced by a humbled, anxious, and deeply introspective murmur. They now understood that the world had not merely changed with their defeat. It had been fundamentally and irrevocably transformed, and they were now relics of a pre-atomic age, trying to comprehend a new world order from behind a wall of barbed wire. To understand the reactions of Hitler's generals to the American atomic bomb, one must first decipher the complex and ultimately failed puzzle of the German nuclear program itself, the Uran project. Their responses in the summer of 1945 were not born in a vacuum. They were the culmination of years of decisions, misconceptions, and a specific, fatally flawed technological worldview. The enigma of why Germany, with its brilliant scientific tradition, failed where the Allies succeeded is the essential backdrop against which their post-war justification was built. The German nuclear effort began with a significant head start. In 1938, German chemists Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann, with their physicist colleague Lise Meitner, achieved the first recognized nuclear fission of uranium. The theoretical foundation was laid, and the potential for a revolutionary new source of energy, and by extension, an explosive of unimaginable power, was immediately grasped by physicists across the globe. At the outbreak of war in 1939, Germany possessed some of the world's leading nuclear scientists, including Werner Heisenberg, a Nobel laureate and one of the founding fathers of quantum mechanics. The Uranverein, or Uranium Club, was established, bringing together these great minds under the auspices of the War Office. On paper, the conditions were ripe for a breakthrough. However, from its inception, the program was plagued by a series of critical errors in fundamental judgment and strategic direction. The first, and perhaps most decisive, was a miscalculation in the early stages of the war. In a crucial meeting with representatives from the Army Ordnance Office in September 1939, the physicists, led by Heisenberg, were tasked with evaluating the feasibility of a nuclear weapon. The conclusion they presented was that while the science was sound, the industrial and economic effort required to separate the rare isotope uranium-235 from the far more common uranium-238 was so colossal that it could not be achieved within the time frame of a war expected to be short. They believed the war would be over long before such a project could bear fruit. This initial assessment effectively relegated nuclear research to a low-priority, academic pursuit, denying it the overwhelming resources and political urgency that would characterize the Manhattan Project. This miscalculation was compounded by a second, deeply consequential error, the choice of moderator. To sustain a nuclear chain reaction, a moderator is needed to slow down neutrons so they can efficiently split other uranium atoms. The Manhattan Project would eventually and correctly settle on ultrapure graphite as the most practical choice for a reactor. The German team, however, following a calculation by physicist Walther Bode which overestimated the neutron absorption of graphite, dismissed it entirely. This erroneous conclusion, now believed by some to be a critical mistake and by others a subtle act of scientific sabotage, forced them down a far more difficult path. They chose heavy water as their moderator. Heavy water, a compound where hydrogen is replaced by its heavier isotope, deuterium, was phenomenally rare and difficult to produce in quantity. Its primary source was the Norsk hydro plant in German-occupied Norway, which became a key strategic target for Allied saboteurs and bombers. The entire German reactor program became tethered to the slow, vulnerable, and inadequate production of this single substance. The program also suffered from a fragmented and non-coordinated structure, a hallmark of the chaotic and competitive nature of the Nazi state. Unlike the Manhattan Project, which was centralized under the ruthless and efficient leadership of General Leslie Groves, with all scientific efforts directed toward a single, clear goal, the German effort was scattered. Competing factions within the SS, the Army, and the Reich Research Council vied for control, leading to duplicated efforts, bureaucratic infighting, and a lack of clear direction. Scientists like Heisenberg worked on reactor theory, while others pursued isotope separation methods. But there was no overarching, driving force to unite these strands into a weaponizable result. Adolf Hitler himself, despite his fascination with wonder weapons, never grasped the transformative potential of nuclear physics. His imagination was captured by tangible, immediate weapons like the V-2 rocket, to which he allocated vastly more resources and attention. The nuclear program remained a backwater, a scientific curiosity rather than a war-winning priority. The role of the scientists themselves, particularly Werner Heisenberg, remains one of the most debated aspects of this enigma. After the war, Heisenberg and his colleagues propagated a narrative that they had deliberately slowed the project, morally opposed to giving such a weapon to Hitler. They claim to have focused on the development of a nuclear reactor for energy, while understanding the principles of a bomb but consciously avoiding its creation. This narrative of passive resistance became a cornerstone of their post-war rehabilitation. However, the Farm Hall transcripts, the secret British recordings of the captured German scientists in August 1945, reveal a more complex picture. Upon hearing the news of Hiroshima, Heisenberg and his colleagues were not relieved, but shocked, embarrassed, and defensive. Their initial reaction was one of disbelief, followed by a frantic effort to recalculate the critical mass needed for a bomb, an effort that suggested they had been far from a working weapon. The evidence strongly implies that their failure was due more to a combination of scientific miscalculation, strategic misjudgment, and a lack of resources, rather than a coherent moral stand. For the generals in captivity, this entire complex history was largely opaque during the war. They were military men, not nuclear physicists. Their understanding of the Uran project was superficial, filtered through briefings and the prevailing attitude within the high command that it was a long-term, speculative endeavor. They had trusted the scientific assessments they were given. Therefore, when the reality of the American bomb shattered their world in August 1945, their immediate psychological response was not to question the fundamental science, but to search for the managerial and strategic failures within their own system. The German nuclear enigma was, in their eyes, not a story of Allied scientific superiority, but a tragic tale of German missed opportunity, a failure of leadership, a misallocation of resources, and a fatal underestimation of a project that they now saw, with the clarity of hindsight, as the key to ultimate victory. It was this interpretation that would shape everything they said next. The initial, unguarded reactions of Hitler's generals to the first confirmed reports of the atomic bombing of Hiroshima stand as a profound study in cognitive dissonance. For these men, masters of a form of warfare they believed they understood to its absolute limits, the news was not merely shocking. It was an assault on their very framework of reality. The concept of a single bomb annihilating an entire city did not compute within their military calculus. Consequently, their first line of defense was a wall of sheer, unadulterated disbelief, which quickly morphed into a suite of dismissive explanations designed to protect their worldview and salvage their professional pride. The atmosphere in the interrogation centers in the immediate hours following the Allied announcement on August 6, 1945, was electric with a peculiar form of denial. The hidden microphones installed by the Allies captured not cries of despair, but the low, urgent murmur of skepticism. The most immediate and pervasive theory among the generals was that this was a masterstroke of Allied propaganda, a psychological operation on a global scale designed to intimidate the Japanese into surrender and to demoralize any remaining German resistance movements. They were, after all, veterans of a war where propaganda had been a primary weapon. They had seen its power and its deceit. To them, the description of the bomb's power seemed too fantastical, too perfectly tailored to create maximum terror. It fit the pattern of a well-crafted lie, one they believed was aimed at securing a quicker, cheaper end to the Pacific War and establishing uncontested Allied dominance in the post-war order. This suspicion was fueled by their own military experience. These were men who had planned and executed the blitzkrieg, the bombing of Coventry, and the siege of Stalingrad. Their understanding of destructive power was grounded in the tangible. The number of sorties flown by a bomber wing, the tonnage of high explosives dropped, the concentration of artillery shells per square meter. The idea that a single aircraft carrying a single device could achieve what required a 1,000-bomber raid was, in their professional judgment, a physical impossibility. The numbers did not add up. Their dismissals often took a technical tone. Perhaps the Americans had simply perfected a new type of conventional explosive, a blockbuster bomb of 10 or 20 tons, and were exaggerating its effect for psychological effect. They speculated that the reported destruction was the result of a massive secondary explosion, a munitions factory or a fuel depot, ignited by a conventional attack, with the atomic story fabricated to cover a lucky strike. Underpinning this technical skepticism was a deeper, more cultural form of dismissal, a lingering sense of technological superiority. While they acknowledged American industrial might, many of the German generals held a quiet contempt for American scientific and technical ingenuity. In their view, the United States was a nation of mass producers and practical engineers, not of theoretical pioneers. They saw their own V-2 rocket and Me-262 jet fighter as evidence of a more refined, sophisticated, and ultimately superior technological mind. The notion that this same American scientific community, which they perceived as derivative and unoriginal, could have solved the most profound physics puzzle of the age while their own revered scientists like Heisenberg had not, was a bitter pill they refused to swallow. It was easier to believe in a hoax than to accept that their enemies had achieved a quantum leap in science that had eluded the fatherland. The reactions of specific high-ranking officers illustrate this spectrum of denial. A figure like Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the epitome of the old Prussian officer corps, reportedly met the news with a stoic, dismissive wave of the hand, muttering about science fiction and refusing to engage with the topic further. For him, war was an art of maneuver and will, not of physics. For the more technically minded generals, like Albert Kesselring or Heinz Guderian, the dismissal was more analytical. They were heard dissecting the reports, pointing out perceived inconsistencies and arguing that even if some new weapon had been used, its strategic impact was being wildly overstated. They fell back on the doctrine they knew. Wars were won by armies on the ground, by control of territory, by breaking the enemy's will to fight through sustained pressure, not by a single, spectacular blast. This collective disbelief was a fragile shield, and it began to crack within days. The bombing of Nagasaki on August 9th provided a brutal, replicative proof that made the propaganda theory untenable. No psychological operation would require the destruction of a second city. Then came the detailed radio reports and the eventual publication of photographs and eyewitness accounts in the controlled press they were allowed to see. The sheer volume and consistency of the reporting, coupled with the swift and unconditional surrender of Japan, which the generals recognized as a nation of immense fighting spirit, eroded the foundations of their denial. The transition from disbelief to a grim, horrified acceptance was a deeply psychological shock. It was the moment the ground shifted beneath them. The rules of the game they had spent their lives mastering had been rendered obsolete overnight. Their initial dismissal was not merely stubbornness. It was the last defense of a professional identity facing annihilation. Once that defense crumbled, they were left naked before a new and terrifying reality, forced to confront not only the power of their conquerors, but also the staggering magnitude of their own regime's failure. The comfortable explanations, propaganda, exaggeration, a lucky strike, evaporated leaving behind the cold, hard fact of the bomb and the urgent, uncomfortable question it posed. How had Germany, with all its scientific genius, allowed this to happen? The stage was now set for the next phase of their captivity, the frantic and self-serving search for answers. With the dust of Hiroshima and Nagasaki settling and the initial, reflexive disbelief worn away by the incontrovertible weight of evidence, the Allied interrogators shifted their strategy. The purpose was no longer to gather tactical military intelligence about a defeated enemy. It was to probe the psyche of that enemy's leadership, to understand the strategic and scientific blind spots of the Third Reich, and to gauge the new geopolitical landscape through the eyes of its most accomplished and now most humbled practitioners. The interrogation rooms became a stage for a profound intellectual and psychological confrontation, where the captured German generals were forced to stare directly into the face of the unthinkable. The Allied questioners, primarily British and American intelligence officers from organizations like MI-19 and the U.S. Office of Strategic Services, OSS, were well prepared. They possessed a growing body of information from the Alsos mission, the Allied operation tasked with capturing German scientific secrets and personnel. They knew the broad outlines of the failed Uran project. Their approach was subtle, a blend of professional courtesy and pointed, Socratic questioning designed to elicit not just answers, but reflection. They presented the facts of the Manhattan Project not as a taunt, but as a established reality, and then asked the pivotal question, why couldn't you do this? This single query forced the generals out of their military domain and into a post-mortem of their nation's entire scientific-industrial war effort. The responses, meticulously documented in interrogation transcripts and the personal notes of the intelligence officers, revealed a fascinating and immediate pivot. The conversation swiftly moved away from the sheer destructive power of the bomb itself and turned inward toward a frantic, often self-exculpating, analysis of German failure. Confronted with the ultimate symbol of Allied technological triumph, the generals' pride would not allow them to simply concede superiority. Instead, they constructed a narrative of missed opportunity, a tragedy of errors in which they were the prescient visionaries let down by the system. A central theme that emerged was the blame placed squarely on the chaotic and irrational nature of the Nazi command structure, with Adolf Hitler as its epicenter. Figures like Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, the brilliant strategist of the Eastern Front, argued with cold precision that the Führer's grasp of advanced technology was primitive and theatrical. They contended that Hitler's imagination was captured by tangible, retaliatory weapons like the V-2 rocket, which he could envision and demand, but he lacked the patience or the intellectual depth to fund a long-term, speculative project like the atomic bomb. They described a system where competing fiefdoms, the SS, the Luftwaffe, the Army, vied for resources, making a centralized, all-consuming effort like the Manhattan Project impossible. In their telling, they were the rational military professionals who understood modern warfare, hamstrung by a political leadership that was, in the words of one interrogator's report, addicted to miracle cures. Simultaneously, a significant portion of their critique was directed at their own scientific community. The name Werner Heisenberg was uttered with a mixture of respect and bitter accusation. The generals posited that their physicists had failed them. The prevailing view among the military men in captivity was that Heisenberg and his team had provided pessimistic assessments of the bomb's feasibility, either due to a fundamental miscalculation or, as some darkly hinted, a lack of will. They felt they had been misled by the very experts they had trusted. This interpretation allowed them to transfer the burden of failure from the military leadership, which had ultimately set the priorities, to the scientists who had provided the technical advice. It was a convenient division of blame that preserved their own sense of strategic competence. The interrogators also noted a distinct and telling divergence in how the generals viewed the bomb's strategic implications. Nearly to a man, they initially downplayed its revolutionary impact on land warfare in the European context. They argued, with a certain military logic, that the bomb was a weapon of terror against civilian populations, not a tactical tool to destroy armies at the front. A bomb that could destroy a city, they reasoned, was not as useful for stopping a tank division in the field. This analysis, while technically correct in a narrow sense, missed the larger point entirely. The bomb had rendered their entire concept of grand strategy obsolete. It was a failure of imagination, an attempt to fit the atomic age into the doctrinal frameworks of blitzkrieg and total war they had mastered. Perhaps the most significant psychological undercurrent, which the interrogators were keen to document, was the palpable sense of historical tragedy that now gripped the generals. The realization that Germany had been on the right track, that they possessed the initial scientific advantage, was a source of profound anguish. Their conversations were laced with phrases like "if only" and "what might have been." They painted a picture of an alternate history where a more rational leadership, a more determined scientific effort, and a more cohesive state apparatus could have delivered the atomic bomb to the Third Reich. This was not merely speculation, it was a coping mechanism. By framing their failure as a near success, they could mitigate the sting of total defeat. They had not been defeated by a superior foe in a fair contest. They had been defeated by their own internal dysfunctions, a narrative that was far more palatable to their bruised egos. The prisoner interviews thus captured a pivotal moment, the precise instant when the shock of the new weapon transformed into a settled, if painful, historical fact in the minds of the defeated, and the great work of rewriting their own history began. In the cold, clear light of hindsight, the failure of the Third Reich to develop an atomic bomb reveals itself not as a simple tale of scientific miscalculation, but as a profound moral and strategic bankruptcy. The transcripts from the interrogation centers and the subsequent memoirs of the generals present a narrative of missed opportunity, a story where they are the tragic heroes let down by a madman and hesitant scientists. However, a deeper, more honest analysis exposes a different truth. The German nuclear effort was doomed not by a single error, but by a pervasive cultural and institutional arrogance that poisoned every level of the endeavor. The cost of this arrogance was the ultimate weapon, and with it, any fleeting chance for victory or negotiated peace. The first and most fatal form of this arrogance was strategic. The German high command, from Hitler down to the OKW staff, fundamentally misjudged the nature of the war they were fighting. They viewed it through the lens of 1914 to 1918 and their swift victories of 1939 to 41, a conflict of limited duration won by tactical brilliance and short, decisive campaigns. This short war illusion meant that any project requiring a multi-year, multi-billion Reichsmark investment with no guaranteed short-term return was deemed impractical. The Manhattan Project was, by contrast, a monumental gamble born of a long war mentality. The Allies understood they were in a total war for survival, requiring a total commitment to technological supremacy. The German leadership, convinced of their inherent superiority, could not conceive of a war lasting long enough for such a project to mature. This was not a simple miscalculation. It was a failure of strategic imagination rooted in an arrogant belief that their initial successes had already decided the conflict's outcome. This strategic arrogance was mirrored and amplified by a deep-seated scientific hubris. The German physics community, particularly figures like Werner Heisenberg, operated with a profound sense of intellectual entitlement. They believed that because the theoretical foundations of nuclear fission were laid in Germany, the practical application would naturally follow their lead. The farm hall transcripts are revelatory in this regard. Upon hearing the news of Hiroshima, Heisenberg's first reaction was not to praise the Allied achievement, but to question it, followed by a frantic, almost comical, attempt to lecture his captured colleagues on the bomb's principles, complete with back-of-the-envelope calculations to prove he had understood it all along. This was not the behavior of a man who had morally scrupled against building the bomb. It was the behavior of a man whose pride was wounded because someone else had solved the puzzle first. The German program was plagued by theoretical purity over practical engineering, a belief that if the problem was elegantly solved on paper, the industrial application would be a mere formality. They looked down upon the perceived brute force, industrial approach of the Americans, failing to recognize that brute force, the coordinated effort of hundreds of thousands of people and billions of dollars, was precisely what was required to bridge the gap between theory and reality. Furthermore, the Nazi state's ideological corruption directly crippled its scientific potential. The regime's fanatical adherence to Aryan physics and its persecution of Jewish science, notably Einstein's theories, led to a brain drain of catastrophic proportions. the very minds that might have driven the urine project to success. Einstein, Szilard, Fermi, Teller had been forced to flee, and they took their genius directly to the Allied cause. The Manhattan Project was, in many ways, built by the refugees of Nazi intolerance. The regime, in its arrogant belief in racial purity, had systematically purged itself of the intellectual diversity necessary for such a monumental breakthrough. The remaining scientists worked in an atmosphere of suspicion and political conformity, where intellectual risk-taking was dangerous and innovation was stifled by dogma. For the generals in captivity, acknowledging this full spectrum of failure was psychologically impossible. To admit that their defeat was due not to bad luck, but to a systemic rot, a rot from which they themselves were not entirely free, would have been tantamount to intellectual suicide. It was easier to blame Hitler's specific disinterest in the project or Heisenberg's alleged miscalculations than to confront the fact that the entire Nazi project was inherently incapable of such a collaborative, long-term, and intellectually free endeavor. Their retrospective analysis was therefore a carefully curated exercise in blame-shifting. They presented themselves as modern, rational technocrats trapped in a medieval court of irrationality. The ultimate cost of this layered arrogance was the balance of power in the post-war world. A German atomic bomb in 1944 or early 1945 would have been a geopolitical earthquake of unimaginable proportions. It could have forced a stalemate on the Western Front, terrified the advancing Red Army into hesitation, or provided the regime with a tool of blackmail to secure a negotiated peace, however temporary. But the very traits that defined the Third Reich, its hubristic belief in its own destiny, its ideological rigidity, its chaotic governance, and its contempt for its adversaries, ensured that this ultimate weapon remained forever out of reach. The generals, in their post-war reflections, lamented the missed opportunity, but they failed to see that the opportunity was never truly there. It was annihilated by the same arrogance that led them to wage a war of annihilation in the first place. The atomic bomb was a mirror held up to the Nazi state, and the reflection it showed was one of a deeply flawed, self-destructive system, incapable of achieving the very technological miracle it so desperately sought. The conversations captured in the interrogation centers of 1945 did not end with the release of the generals. They echoed into the decades that followed, shaping not only the personal legacies of these men, but also the foundational military doctrines of the Cold War and our modern understanding of technological warfare. The legacy of the American atomic bomb, as filtered through the perspectives of Hitler's generals, is a complex tapestry of professional insight, profound moral evasion, and a chillingly accurate prediction of the New World Order. Their forced confrontation with the unstoppable weapon forced upon them a clarity about future conflict that their victors were only beginning to grasp. For the individual generals, the bomb became the ultimate alibi. In their memoirs and in the interviews they granted in the post-war years, figures like Manstein, Guderian, and Speer consistently returned to the atomic bomb as the definitive explanation for the inevitability of Germany's defeat. It was a narrative tool of immense power. By framing the bomb as an unforeseeable, war-winning wonder weapon, they could subtly downplay the significance of the catastrophic military defeats on the Eastern Front, the failure of the Ardennes offensive, and the colossal strategic errors of the German high command. The bomb allowed them to write a history in which they were not defeated by the Red Army's courage or the Allies' material strength in a conventional sense, but by a single, apocalyptic scientific discovery that no amount of their tactical genius could have countered. This provided a veneer of respectability to their memoirs, allowing them to critique the Nazi leadership while preserving their own reputations as master strategists rendered obsolete by a new age. Beyond personal legacy, the generals' immediate and almost unanimous assessment of the bomb's strategic implications proved remarkably prescient. While they initially downplayed its tactical use, they quickly understood its geopolitical meaning. They recognized instantly that the bomb was not merely a weapon to end a war, but an instrument to dictate the peace. Their analyses, as recorded by their interrogators, pointed to a future where traditional notions of continental warfare, based on massed armies and front lines, were finished. They foresaw a world where supreme power would be vested in the nation that possessed and was willing to wield this ultimate deterrent. With a chilling clarity born of their own recent experience with total war, they predicted the bipolar standoff that would become the Cold War. They understood that the bomb made direct confrontation between major powers suicidal, and they accurately predicted that future conflicts would be fought through proxies, in the shadows, and under the constant threat of mutual annihilation. In a strange twist of fate, the men who had planned Operation Barbarossa became among the earliest and most perceptive analysts of nuclear deterrence theory. This legacy, however, is stained by a glaring and deliberate moral silence. In all their sophisticated analysis of the bomb's strategic impact, the generals almost universally avoided any deep reflection on its ethical dimensions. The destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was discussed by them as a strategic event, a demonstration of power, a fait accompli. There is a stark absence in their recorded words of any sustained consideration for the hundreds of thousands of civilians who were vaporized, irradiated, and burned. This was a continuation of the mindset that had prosecuted a war of annihilation in the East, where human life was a currency to be spent for strategic objectives. The atomic bomb, in their view, was simply the logical, if terrifying, endpoint of total war, a more efficient way to achieve what bomber fleets had already been doing over Hamburg, Dresden, and Tokyo. Their failure to grapple with the bomb's unique moral horror reveals the limits of their purely military worldview and stands as a permanent indictment of their character. Finally, the legacy of the unstoppable weapon, as seen through their eyes, is one of technological fatalism. The bomb represented a point of no return. It ended the era in which they were masters and initiated an age where the scientist in the laboratory held more power than the field marshal at his command post. Their bitter ruminations on the German failure underscored a new, terrifying reality for the post-war world. The nation that could most effectively harness pure science, organize its industrial might, and maintain a long-term strategic vision would hold the keys to global power. The frantic, self-serving question they asked, "Why didn't we get it first?" became the defining anxiety of the next half-century, driving the arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union. In the end, the legacy of the bomb for Hitler's generals was multifaceted. It was their personal excuse, their strategic crystal ball, and the ultimate proof of their regime's failure. Their captured conversations provide a unique and invaluable timestamp, capturing the precise moment the old world of warfare died and the new, more dangerous one was born. They were the first military strategists of stature to be forced to reckon with a weapon that made their entire profession potentially obsolete. While they expertly dissected the bomb's impact on strategy and power, their conscious avoidance of its human cost ensured that their legacy, though historically significant, would forever remain incomplete, a sophisticated analysis of the mechanics of apocalypse that willfully ignored its face.